So, what exactly do you mean when you say, what do you mean?
I do not understand this. This really confuses me.
What's that supposed to mean?
Literally.
What's that supposed to mean?
What's that supposed to mean?
I don't know what you're talking about.
What are you talking about?
What's that supposed to mean?
Cultural anthropologist Ujwal Arkalgud and Motive Base president Jason Partridge will tell you that perception and meaning are the primary pressure points that shape and create the world we live in.
Inconceivable! You keep using that word.
Let's explore why meaning matters.
I don't think it means what you think it means.
Now, here's your host, Aaron Trafford.
All right, welcome to show number 1. And we have a lot to unpack in this show, I think. So the best place to start today, I really think, is the most obvious place, which is attempting to answer the question we're asking in the name of the show. Why meaning matters. And what's interesting to me, or what I'd like to uncover a little bit, is the dichotomy between meaning at the individual level and then at the cultural level. And I think if we look at things through those lenses, we're going to end up with a really great conversation and going places. So Ujwal, let's chat about this over coffee, because that's really where this all started, was a conversation about coffee and the culture of coffee. And I say this as I'm sitting here sipping like my 5th cup of the day already. So it's a natural place to start, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. I was just enjoying a nice cup of joe with a friend of mine last weekend, and he said, here's something I didn't know about coffee, that I somehow needed 5 tasting notes about this cup of joe in my life, and I think that's a great place to start, because speaking of cultural meaning, or meaning that gets established in culture, coffee is one of those cultures, one of those things that has completely transformed in the last decade. Suddenly now, when we buy coffee, there are 4 or 5 major vectors of meaning that we are absorbing and dealing with in the decisions we make. Was this coffee farmed ethically? Were the workers paid well? What are the tasting notes like? Will this coffee bean work well with whatever intricate machine or system I have at home? There's so much to it now. And, one could argue that the world of coffee has sort of become just as complex as the world of wine or even beer. But I think this is what's fascinating about how meaning changes over time.
And Jason, when we were young, and our parents would put us in the car, Saturday morning, we're going to go to the grocery store, then we're going to go to the park, whatever we were doing, the coffee stop wasn't a thing. It was completely different when we were growing up.
It's completely different. I mean, even this morning, I think about the pressure that got put on me as I went to a Starbucks and my wife wanted a vanilla latte. And the lineup was so big, and I'm looking at my watch, and I know that we've got things to do and kids to get to daycare. And God forbid I had to just get her a dark roast with milk because I didn't have time to wait for them to prepare it. And there was this fear and trepidation of me going back with something that just didn't live up to the expectation.
So, okay, vectors of meaning and decision making, break that down for me, because I'm also the same way. I'm standing there in the Starbucks coffee line. I'm worried I'm going to be judged for my order being too simple, but then I'm worried that I'm going to take too long if my order is too complex. From the individual level, how do we tie this back to meaning? And also, can you confirm that it can feel exhausting sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of exhausting, I'll give you a great example. The last wave of the pandemic, India was really reeling, and there were literally mass cremations happening in New Delhi. And there was a photo tweeted by a Washington Post journalist, Annie Goen, and in the tweet, she said, "Stunning images of mass cremation." And I use this example because clearly, I mean, we all know she meant, shocking, she meant devastating, but she used the word stunning. And of course, the Twitterverse in India, including a lot of reputed journalists in India, got very upset. And they said, this is an insensitive comment. And of course, her response was, look up the dictionary. Stunning can be used in a positive and a negative context. The reason I bring this example up is because, is she right? Technically, yes, but culturally, no. Because if you look at the word stunning, when is it most often used in culture? Stunning places to visit, stunning homes, stunning this, stunning that, stunning, people, men and women, or, beautiful faces. Stunning is implied beauty. It's positive. It's not something that's devastating and heartbreaking and gut-wrenching. And this is what's special about the world of meaning. It's not about what is technically true. It's about how a word is used, what context it is placed into in culture that defines its meaning.
I also think it's really interesting, Ujwal, because, the role of the journalist is to report and connect with the reader. And when we think about companies that are trying to connect with the consumer, they're in a very similar place where sometimes what they think is what something means is not what the consumer thinks it means. And the challenge is that if there's that disconnect or there's that kind of gap that sits there, that's where people can get in trouble, like that journalist did.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the brilliance that you two bring at MotiveBase is unpacking all of this for the people that you work with and putting it into context and having actionable insights there. So, and you gave me a quote from Bill Gates, which I want to reference here so that we can really dig into the next layer, which is this cultural meaning layer. He said, we always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10.
Yeah.
So if we look at that quote, which I think is very true, and we back up from today, 10 years, right? We're at the end, we're coming out of arguably, I don't know, you guys tell me, like one of the biggest financial crises of our generation. What did we learn? Like what happened then and how have meanings changed since then?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think the reason why the Bill Gates quote, and I think it's more than 20 years old if I remember correctly, the reason why it's so powerful is because traditionally speaking, even today, most companies, they predict where shifts are happening. They use behavior data to predict. And the problem with behavior is it changes a lot in the short term and flip-flops a lot, and it makes it very difficult to model it. The pandemic is a great example, right? We're still buying with constraints because we don't have access to things, or, things aren't available in the same way, and, shipping delays and blah, blah, blah. And the same was true even 10, 20 years ago. Even coming out of the financial crisis, there was so much change in behavior, short-term change in behavior. People thought, oh my God, all of this stuff will change. But then when you look at meaning, what meaning teaches us is that meaning changes gradually over time. Meaning is kind of like a glacier. And there's a slow, continuous movement. Not only can you track it, you can measure it, you can model it, you can predict it with much greater accuracy than you can do with behavior. And it allows our clients in particular to do exactly, or to avoid exactly the problem that Bill Gates is highlighting there, right? Because if we overestimate short-term change, we're going to make big mistakes, especially when we're trying to innovate. Because innovation isn't cheap. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of time.
Well, let's take that right back to the coffee example. If you look at, 20 years ago or 25 years ago, when a cup of coffee was just a cup of Joe at Dunkin' Donuts, when we started to see a shift and a change, it was largely linked back to, fair trade farming. It was how farmers were being treated. And that is essentially the behavior that started to kind of shape and transition how people were thinking about coffee. Now, if you just put all your bets onto fair trade coffee, you are missing the bigger picture, or the meanings that we're starting to assemble around that. Meanings like sophistication, meanings like being worldly, meanings like, can I take something like a cup of coffee and understand that it comes from different regions, has these different tasting notes? That ladders to something that's much bigger, which is really the ability to kind of exert social capital in a new occasion. Again, all of a sudden, coffee becomes like wine. I know a lot about wine and people respect respect me for it. Now I have the opportunity to do it in this new occasion. At the end of the day, if you make a bet on that short-term behavior change, which is in and around something like fair trade farming, if you don't zoom out and take a look at how that is being impacted by all these different associations, you don't have the full picture, and you don't have a really clear gamut on what you can be doing to make long-term investment and long-term inroads.
So how do we then look at what happened 10 years ago and kind of, coffee being a great example, but was there another example that sticks out to you of where we kind of, or, the royal we, missed the boat on the changing meaning of something that brought us to today? And I'll give you a little kind of what I mean by that. We're in a pandemic world. Look at what happened in the United States in 2016. Things seem to be changing at a rapid pace. What did we miss 10 years ago?
I mean, there's so many things. I'll use one example, which I think maybe a little over 10 years ago, but a great example is, what happened with the iPod. And a lot of people don't realize this or don't know this story. There's a reason why the iPod had white earbuds, while everybody else had black earbuds. There's a reason for that, because an anthropologist figured out that there was this myth developing in culture of these, he called them cyberpunks, of these people who were downloading music for free. They were using Napster and all these other tools, and they believed music should be freely accessible to everybody. And there was this myth developing that they needed a community of their own. And this was a community that was sort of growing in strength and needed validation. And what the iPod, or what Apple very cleverly did, ironically, a couple of years later, their strategy completely pivoted. But what they brilliantly did was they launched their campaign with, first, a white earbud, because it was clearly recognizable. I could be walking the streets and people would know that I'm an illegal downloader because I had white earbuds. So that was one thing. The second thing they did was their campaign was literally called, people forget this, Rip, Mix, Burn. Can you imagine that? Apple launched saying, go rip the music, mix it, burn it onto your CD, right? Burn it onto your device. And through that, they created meaning around this device that meant that you were a punk. You were willing to kind of stick it to the system, so to speak.
You just gave me chills. There's so much to unpack there, because I'm thinking now, look at what has happened as a result of attaching that cool kid meaning to that device culturally now. And I think this is a whole other conversation we need to have, is like, what does this mean for the next 10 years? Because we are at another huge pivot point culturally, globally, societally. I want to go there. I think that's where we should go in the next episode. How do you guys feel about that?
Sounds great.
I think it makes a lot of sense. I always like to say that cliches exist for a reason. And I love the cliche, you need to see the forest for the trees. And, part of studying meaning is really taking that step back and really understanding the full scope of what's impacting something that matters to you.
All right. Well, I think that that's just a taste of what's to come on this podcast. I hope you're as excited as we are to continue these conversations. If you want to contribute to the conversation, make sure you drop us an email at hello@storystudionetwork.com. Make sure you like this podcast and hit the subscribe button, because trust me, there's lots more goodness coming. That's it for us for this episode. We will see you in the next one.
Thanks for listening to Why Meaning Matters with Ujwal Arkulgud, Jason Partridge, and your host, Aaron Trafford.
Inconceivable! You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Why Meaning Matters is produced for Motive Base and the Story Studio Network by Eye Contact Productions.